Well, good noonday to you, and welcome to High Noon. And you'll notice that Bob Daney is not here today, so I'm here. We'll welcome you here, glad to have you with us. But we're going to go right into our program. Jonathan Small from OCPA. Is that correct? Did I get all those initials correct? Right. And you'll tell us what those are all about. And then you'll also tell us, give us an overview of what you're going to talk about when you start, because I don't even know myself where you're going with this thing today. So give a big hand for Jonathan Small.
Paul, you're too kind. I don't know what I'm going to go with or talk about either. So, just kidding. So most of you know who the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs is. My boss, I think, talked to you in December to let you know kind of where OCPA thought we were headed. And one of the things that we like to remind people is that we are the state's free market think tank. There's a liberal think tank that has a name that's similar to ours, and that's if the newspaper is going to talk to a think tank, that's who they go talk to. But we're the free market think tank, and we work on a number of different issues. And so today I want to talk a little bit about a couple of things that are going on at the Capitol, and we can get right into it. Raise your hand if you have heard the stories about the fact that the state might have $170 million less to spend. Raise your hand if you've seen that in the newspaper. Everyone should have seen that. Well, I thought the best way to start a discussion with our friends at the High Noon Club is to seek the public policy prowess of the Tulsa Public School Superintendent, Lisa Presley, which is this. There has never been enough revenue for public education, and there never will be. Or Tahlequah, I said Tahlequah, sorry, excuse me, Roland. I'm getting all mixed up. Yeah, Guyman could have said this, it doesn't matter, you pick the school district. So that was the perspective in 2012. There has never been enough revenue for public education, and there never will be. So let's talk about what's going on with revenues, and I'm going to try to not bore you, but this is really important, and this will help you understand why we're focused on what OCPA is focused on this year. So what's going on with total state expenditures in Oklahoma? One of the great things that you should be happy about is that Oklahoma has set a record. And in fact, it's a time of all-time highs in Oklahoma. You guys should applaud. Don't applaud because you're about to find out what it's an all-time high. As many of you have seen, you know kind of how the party makeup has been in Oklahoma for the first century basically. And then one of the things that we started doing, because lawmakers started claiming that they had cut spending. And so we wanted to see, well, if they say they cut spending, and they've actually cut spending, then we ought to be able to look at, the data and see that. And what you'll notice in this picture is that no matter what the year, spending continues to climb. Even in the deepest, darkest recession on planet Earth that was brought to us by the current president, state government still found a way to spend more in the deepest, darkest recession on planet Earth, other than the Depression. In fact, somewhat coming out of the recession, the current leadership, I don't need to remind you who's in leadership, but if you're in doubt of who is, I have the party affiliation right down there for you. It's ours. That's all I'll say. They managed to increase spending over $300 million over the prior year. Now, let me make sure to clarify this. This comes from the Office of Management and Enterprise Services. So this is not OCPA's numbers. All I did was go to the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report and pull off basically the financial statement, what the spending is for the state. So So what's one of the things that's growing? Remember, you heard about that report that, oh, the legislature has 170 million less to appropriate this next coming year. The sky is falling, doom and gloom. It's now Bangladesh and Oklahoma. Well, actually, that's not the case. Last year, just in the most recent fiscal year, Oklahoma set a record for total state tax collections. So despite the fact that many of our families have seen increases in the payroll tax, where we lost 2% of our income, that was a gift of one of the budget deals. The fact that we saw many of Oklahoma families are seeing their health insurance premiums go up. You're seeing taxes for the Affordable Care Act, which really we've now seen as the Unaffordable Care Act, Obamacare, Obamacare, whatever you want to call it. Those are weighing down on families. We're seeing food prices rise because of government's idiotic use of requiring ethanol spending. So all of those things, but yet still we have record tax collections. So last year, even despite all of that, the state brought in a record $7.86 billion. So some people will tell you that government doesn't have any money. No, it actually has record revenues. Let's talk about some of the things that are the highest. Here's what's interesting. In the most recent fiscal year, the state actually set a record for state income tax collections. This despite the fact that the income tax rate just 10 years ago was 7% when we collected this amount, and now it's 5.25%. So if you remember all the doom and gloom when lawmakers started talking about cutting taxes in the mid-2000s, we were told, again, Oklahoma was become Bangladesh. We were going to have huge revenue losses. We haven't even seen that. Actually, when you cut income taxes, you actually want them to decrease. I know several of the lawmakers would agree with me. And when the economy's doing well, we haven't even really been able to see that yet. There's some other areas of growth, though. This one is the one that's the most remarkable, sales tax collections. Sales tax collections have increased almost $1 billion in just the last 10 years. They've increased, in fact, 62% over 2003, which is a testament to the fact that when you give Oklahomans back their money and their capital, they actually spend it and employ it better than the government does. Actually, what's interesting is that, so the 10-year growth rate in sales taxes is 6%. So now I'm getting really nerdy and you can fall asleep. But what's interesting about that is the growth rate before the tax cuts was right at around 3.5 to 3.8%. It's now almost up to 6% per year, which is proof that, again, once you give citizens more of their own money, they spend it much better than government. And so now we're going to get to one of my favorite charts. It's a recent chart. You've heard a lot about the starvation of common education in Oklahoma and the fact that children can't learn now because you're not spending enough money on classrooms and you're not spending enough money on education. Well, did you know that despite the worst recession since the Depression, common education spending, both state and local spending, has never declined? Even in the recession, schools in Oklahoma still had more to spend than they had the prior year. So again, because you're not hearing this in the paper. So again, these are not OCPA's numbers. If you go to the State Department of Education's website and you look on their transparency page and you look at total spending by schools, you can see that total spending by schools has increased $300 million over just the last 4 years. But that's not all. So you've heard about, oh man, we have these gigantic class sizes, and 1 million new students have come into Common Ed, and now we have classroom sizes of 100, and no one can learn anything. So what's happened with student population growth in Oklahoma? Well, there's two ways that they look at enrollment in education. First of all, they look at what's called average daily attendance, which is what they use for the state aid formula. And what you'll notice, which is very curious to me, I thought this was interesting, that in total, the average daily attendance is only right under 28,000. So we've basically had a growth in students of less than 5% over roughly about 4 or 5 years. So we're increasing by about 1% per year, somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 in total, the amount of children going into the public education system in Oklahoma. That's hardly a lemming march on schools. That's hardly, birth rates that rival rabbits happening and children going to school. It's not near the crisis that we've heard. So let's take the other measurement. Now when they're begging your lawmaker to give more money to education despite outcomes and despite it's not changing anything, the number that they like to use is the enrollment number. So even if you use the number that they like to use, they go back and forth which number they want to use depending on what they're trying to get. But if you use the October 1 enrollment, which is a snapshot in time where they say, okay, how many people were in Oklahoma public schools on October 1? You still have the same problem where if you compare it from the year that we have the most data compared to spending and 2008, the year that they say they love so much, you still are only seeing population growth in schools of about 4.7%. So when they tell you that they have bigger class sizes, what that bigger class sizes amounts to is the average class size in 2008 was 17 kids in a class. Now it may be 18 or 19. So it is accurate that they have record class sizes. And remember, so when you're talking about records, all you need to have a record in this year versus the other year is just to be one more than the other year. So if one more kid enrolls next year, they're at record enrollment. Now here's the thing that we've been trying to highlight recently, and this may be hard to see, but a lot of you have heard, in Oklahoma we're the lowest spending per pupil. Again, our kids won't learn anything because we're not spending enough money. Actually, if you look at all of the spending, both state and local spending, because right now, and that's a discussion for another day, right now, common education spending is a partnership between the state and local governments and districts. That's just the way it is right now. I'm not saying that we support that or that it shouldn't change, but that's the way you look at it. So if you're looking at it that way, then you have to look at all the sources of revenue. So if you look at state and local revenue and all those expenses, per pupil spending is not the weak 6,000, 7,000 that you see in the paper, but it's 10,000. So you'll hear a lot them say, if you try to implement, Representative Reynolds' tax credit program or voucher, no parent's ever going to be able to use it because private education is far more expensive than public education. How many times have you heard that, Representative Reynolds? You hear that all the time.
100%.
That's what you hear all the time. But I can tell you right now, my children are in a blended model at the Academy of Classical Christian Studies, and the tuition that we pay is $3,100. I know that the tuition at CHA and other Christian schools is in the range of somewhere between $600 and $7,500. That's way less than the $10,000 plus that we're spending. And this doesn't include the legislature's contributions to the teachers' retirement system, which are over $300 million a year. It doesn't include off-the-top monies to OLAP and other programs. So here's what you're hearing. We've seen a decrease in per pupil spending. They are correct. There has been a decrease in per pupil spending. But that decrease amounts to what is about $40 per student, or minus 0.46% from the prior year. Hardly a crisis. I didn't have time to get to it today. I would show you some of my favorite pictures that have caused quite the stir on Facebook. I began to post the activity buses of schools that say they lack so much in revenue and need more of your money, and it's quite phenomenal. They're buses that I've never ridden in before. You would be surprised, and it's across the spectrum. It's suburban schools, it's rural schools, it's inner city schools. It doesn't matter. So here's the other thing. When you look at, if you look at what they want to look at, October enrollment, some of the time, still roughly the same. If you look at the number that they want to use when they're saying how many kids they have and how much they need more of your money, the change from this year to the prior year was about 0.17% less in per student funding. But this is the thing that's amazing that they're not talking to you about. And that's the increase in local revenue in schools. Did you know that in Oklahoma, local revenue used by all the common education schools increased every year throughout the recession, despite the recession? You guys haven't heard that, have you? You haven't heard the newspapers talking about that. In fact, total local revenue by schools is now $300 million more than it was in fiscal year 2008 per year. So they were getting about 1.7 billion in local revenue. Now they're getting over $300 million more in local revenue. Now what I would argue is that actually the best way to fund schools is at the local level, because it keeps more control at the local level. And actually, if you look at states that have the best tax structures, they have far more funding at the local level and less intrusion at the state level. Texas is an example. They rely much more on local revenues than they do on state revenues to fund public education. And then if you look at per pupil revenue is rising at a pretty good clip. You see here now that per pupil revenue is now over $400 per student, increase over $400 per student. And this is a chart that we love to use, which shows how much per pupil spending in education has increased in Oklahoma. That's this red line. And this red line has the vertical leap of Kevin Durant, as you can see. And notice that ACT scores are flat. So they want you to put even more record revenues into education so you can continue to get static scores. This shows the picture also nationally, what's happened. Same thing. Doesn't matter what statistic that you look at. And really what's going on in common education right now is, it would be like in the technology realm if we were still carrying around boom boxes on our ears instead of using an iPhone with earbuds and another set. That's what's happened. And it's because in common education, we take this weird approach with education. We say that, so things like Medicaid, we give people the option to go to the private doctor that they think is best. Roads and bridges, there is no requirement that every inch of road has to be built by a state Department of Transportation employee. Assistance to parents for childcare. We let families choose virtually whatever childcare provider that they want to choose, as long as they register with the Department of Human Services. But when it gets to public education, we have this weird, ridiculous idea that somehow we need to give the money to a state-sponsored brick wall monopoly who doesn't have to compete. And one of the things that I submit to you today is that whatever your feelings are about Common Core, standards, evolution, all of that, as long as they have your money and they take your money and they can force you to where you only have one option to go school is, it's only a matter of time before they pass the next thing that makes us upset and that we feels like violates our liberties. And so that leads me into one thing that OCPA, a recommendation that we made multiple times, is moving to an education savings account, where families would be allowed to, if they're going to take state funds, to use those funds to choose whatever school they want to. We do that with higher education already. What college you go to in Oklahoma is not determined by your address. It is determined that in with common education or K through 12 schools. So finally, for us, the question is, if we give them more money and let them have more money, do we think that it's going to be any different? Every time Charlie Brown believes that Lucy is going to let him kick the ball, and she never lets him kick the ball. Every time we think that we elect this politician or that politician, that they're going to be the ones to manage our funds better. And I submit to you that they're not. One of the second things that OCPA is advocating, you've heard us talk about it, since the recession, the Oklahoma legislature has had an increase in over $1 billion in tax revenues. And not a dollar has been cut for tax cuts. Our leaders used as a bargaining chip or a tool, they forced lawmakers to choose between spending hundreds of millions of dollars unfounded and unsupported on the Capitol and a tax cut. So they played Russian roulette with us as taxpayers and stuck us in the same bill that many knew would get thrown out and predicted would get thrown out, and that's exactly what happened. Think about this. The last tax cut that was passed in Oklahoma was passed by a Republican House, a Democrat Senate, and a Democrat governor. That was the last tax cut that was passed and enacted in Oklahoma. There hasn't been a tax cut since January 2012, but yet revenues are at record highs. Actually, as we speak today, to date, revenues are at record highs. I want to talk just a very small amount, and then I want to get into questions. You've heard a lot about this whole concept or this whole problem of dedicated revenue, and the fact that this is a huge problem and it's out of the legislature's control, and we have less to spend. Well, as you can see from the state's own data, that's a farce. It's a lie. Revenues are the highest that they've ever been. Let's talk about some of those dedicated revenue sources. Raise your hand if you've heard of the teacher's retirement system. Okay. Many of you know that our state has an unfunded liability of $11.5 billion. Well, there's several lawmakers in the room who will remember that the generation of lawmakers before them determined that whenever there wasn't a way to increase spending or increase salaries for government employees, what you could do is give them massive COLA increases or cost of living increases and never fund it. One of the reasons that some of the lawmakers in this room that have been the strongest on fiscal reform supported bills in the early 2000s to dedicate revenue to the teachers' retirement system was to pay off that liability. So what's happening right now in Oklahoma, the teachers' retirement system gets 5% of personal income tax, 5% of corporate income tax, 5% of sales tax, and 5% of use tax. All of that money together is almost $300 million a year that the state puts into the teachers' retirement system, trying to pay off the liability and support retirement to teachers. So let me ask you this, because some people are saying, well, the way to fix this problem for the legislature is to give them more discretionary control over all the revenues that come to government. How well has it worked out in Illinois that the more discretion that they had over revenues, they put those monies into their retirement systems? Who do you trust better? A law that says 5% of income tax has to go to help pay down the liability of the teachers' retirement system, or the discretionary will of the legislature right after a rally of teachers telling them that they need more money for salaries, or the superintendents need more money for their salaries? Which do you trust better? The dedicated revenue and statute, that's the side I'm on, or the discretionary spending prowess of lawmakers? But let's keep talking about some others, because that's not the only one. So there's $300 million. What about the firefighter's pension? It gets roughly $60 million in dedicated revenue a year from the insurance premium tax. How many of you want to rely on lawmakers to make that appropriation in a discretionary manner every year? You think that's going to happen?
No.
Road and bridge repairs and funding. Road and bridge repair funding in Oklahoma was basically held flat for about 20 years. And then as the new generation of lawmakers came into the House in the early 2000s, they said, hey, road and bridge repairs is supposed to be a core function of government. If we're going to have government, that should be a core function of government. We're going to stop taking hundreds of millions of dollars from taxpayers and motor vehicle taxes and driver fees and other fees and not dedicating it to roads and bridges. So what do? They created dedicated revenue of income taxes, and they basically doubled what's been spent on transportation. So now, if you are a truck driver in Oklahoma, there's less bridges to worry about whether or not you're going to die if you drive over them, as what happened in previous decades. Now, how many of you trust, so if you look at all these dedicated revenue sources, the tax commission says that it collected or apportioned about $8.3 billion last year. Of that amount, it sent $5.3 billion to the General Revenue Fund, the fund that lawmakers regularly appropriate fund. How many of you think it would be a good idea to give the legislature immediate, complete access to that other $2.5 billion and trust them to appropriate it where it's supposed to go? Okay, I had one lawmaker raise his hand. That's why we have dedicated revenue. And, you know, Representative Reynolds and Representative Westlaw went somewhere, and if there's any other representatives in the room, they'll tell you that if it's dedicated revenue in statute or appropriated in a bill by the legislature, that's still an appropriation or an authorization by the legislature. It's just one is one that happens every year, and one is another one that's automatic. So with that, our two messages this year is that don't bite the hand that feeds you. It's time for lawmakers to tell tax consumers, don't bite the hand that feeds them, which is us as taxpayers. It's high time that Oklahomans got a tax cut and a real tax cut. We're sandwiched between Kansas, which now has no income tax on small business and has a lower overall income tax rate on every other taxpayer than we do. As you know, Texas has no income tax at all. We're at an economic disadvantage. And then it's time to modernize education spending and provide families choice by allowing the money to follow the child as opposed to funding bricks and mortar and a failed system that has a monopoly on your family's life and your children's life, and that's not going to improve. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, or if you want to boo, go ahead. You can do that.
I want to ask one question. I wondered if lawmakers, sorry Mike and Paul, you're my friends, would be willing to let us handle their retirement program and their spending programs the way that they handle ours. Maybe we can do it by vote of the people.
Right.
I'll stand up. Oh, you are standing up.
I paid good money to come here. I don't have to put up with that kind of stuff. Jonathan, what do you think would be I'm Charles, what would be the best way to pay for the capital improvements?
You know, I think one of the things that I really struggle with, so I think most of you know my background. I started working in the Capitol building in 2003, right out of college, you know, homeschool kid. And so I made my change because I personally witnessed the grotesque waste and dysfunction of government. I witnessed it. That's why I'm at a think tank now trying to eradicate it. Well, we still don't have a clear picture on what's actually wrong with the Capitol. I mean, there's some neat pictures that show sewage and other things like that, but we don't have an unbiased, unadulterated, uninfluenced view of what the Capitol actually needs. I'll give you a prime example. Things cannot be that bad at the Capitol if a deal was cut to give $7 million to the legislature to make what looks like a Russian palace looking room in the Senate. It can't be that bad. It can't be bad enough that they need barriers in the front and scaffolding outside if they cut a deal last year to let the legislature, and it was not rank and file lawmakers, it was a few people. It's funny, you can't find out, nobody will admit to who it is that actually made the deal. They just say a deal was made. You should see this room, you should go see this new room in the Senate. I mean, it looks like a scene out of Frozen. That's the cartoon with the princesses. I have 4 daughters, so I know all about what princess royalty looks like. I mean, this room looks like a room out of the most, opulent castle that you've ever seen. So that's the problem. So, rarely ever is OCPA going to say, we need a feasibility study. But in this case, we need an open, transparent study about what's actually wrong with the Capitol. Jason Murphy said that they've come back and the number of $160 million, they can't even find where that number came from. It's just a number that someone at the Preservation Commission threw out.
I'm Steve. I can say that I know Sally Kern has voted against the budget for the last 2 or 3 years, and I think Paul has too. I'm not sure about Mike, would be surprised if he had voted against it too. Yes, there's a question. Last night, I was watching Channel 4, and they had Ken Miller, our state treasurer, come on, and there was a story there about how that there had been a $1 billion amount of money coming in, but then he was saying, but don't get too excited about it because we still have a shortfall and this kind of a thing. And it seemed like they were trying to say, we got all this money, but yet we don't have this money. What was he really trying to say, and what was he trying to accomplish?
Okay, so this is funny. So this only government comes up with these definitions. So here's what a shortfall means to you and I. We think that, or our boss tells us that we make $25,000 a year. We work really hard for him. We've been getting a check for $25,000 a year. We start that year, he says your salary is $25,000 a year. You work all the way through that year, and he pays you $20,000 instead of $25,000. A shortfall to government is we come out with a really stupid rosy projection that we're going to see revenue growth when taxpayers are taking it in the from all levels of government, and that we're going to see 5-6% growth. And then because we only see 3% growth, that's somehow a shortfall. That's what they're talking about. They overestimated how much revenues were going to grow from one year to the next. So even though revenues are at record highs, government's seeing more than a 2% increase in revenues, while U.S. families have seen at least 2% on the payroll tax and other sources. Here's the problem with Oklahoma's government. Unlike other states like Kansas and Wisconsin and other states, during the recession, we became overly reliant on stimulus dollars, which some of these lawmakers fought, which created a structural deficit. We also took out a private loan from the private sector. And then lastly, the other thing that happened is we chose to use revolving funds and rob from funds and rob from the Secretary of State and rob from the Insurance Commissioner's revolving fund so that government wouldn't have to cut spending during tough times. That's the problem.
Okay, we have other questions back here? Here, we got one here. Isn't the real problem that you could take those graphs that you showed us and put almost any department or agency in the state on the name line with the same problem?
But it is true that revenue is flat at some agencies that should not exist. So that's why we don't pat lawmakers on the back for holding still spending at an agency that shouldn't even exist. They want us to pat them on the back because they say we held spending still at the Scenic Rivers Commission. Okay, but whatever. But the problem is healthcare authority and Medicaid with the enticement of federal dollars. Did you know that in Oklahoma, what you spend as a state has increased from 2001 to this point by over 217%? The legislature has increased by $1.3 billion what U.S. taxpayers have to spend on an entitlement program, all chasing new revenues, expanding the populations that are available. And that's why Dr. Coburn has warned Oklahoma several times to not expand Medicaid. And thankfully, it looked like that the governor, for right now, was very serious and very opposed to any form of Medicaid expansion. She even mentioned she opposed any effort to try to take those monies and use them for some other plan like Insure Oklahoma. So the thing that we have to do is make sure that we keep them honest and they actually stick to that.
Just for the record, we're not the ones spending the money, we're just the endless flow of money.
Yes, that's exactly
That's
right.
being spent.
Yeah, my name's Harold Hodges. And number one, I would kind of wonder why our legislators are always up here listening to all of this when they ought to be down there at the Capitol working on something.
They're off on Friday.
Off on Friday, well, how about Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday? Another thing, I read about our schools, our education, a kid in the third grade that can't read third grade level, he goes ahead and passes. We're spending 10 times on education in the USA what the rest of the world is together. And yet our kids are number 9, 10, 11, and 12 in every one of the reading, writing, and arithmetic. Another thing here, and I'll get out of your hair. You're talking about the waste of all this education thing. Now you're up here with thieves wanting us to sign up so somebody can waste some little bit more of our money. I don't understand this.
Well, first of all, let me say this. I maybe did not explain. We're a nonprofit organization that doesn't take a penny of government money. So, and and sir, well, let me talk to you for a minute, sir. So you have an idea about my background. It's because of me that the state of Oklahoma is no longer taking millions of your dollars and funneling it to things like dog food plants. It's because of me that me and OCPA that we kept the message strong on opposing the Medicaid expansion. And that's money that someone donated us that believes in the message. You don't have to sign that piece of paper, and please don't if you're not going to have a constructive attitude about participating in the process. These lawmakers work very hard. They're one of the few voices. The problem is, he brings up a great point. You want to know the problem with government spending? Is that the loudest voices are the ones that get the money. And until all of us get involved, on March 31st, there's going to be a rally at the Capitol for public education. So my question is, how many of us are going to show up on March 31st to counter that rally to say, we give enough already. We're not giving another penny. And it'll be hard. We'll have to take off. You'll have to take off a lunch because we're working. We don't have superintendents to make a professional day and then work with the OEA to bring activity buses and leases there. But that's the problem, is that right now, the taxpayer has a very small voice in the Capitol. And until we start making lawmakers that are in office understand that it's in the interest of their future careers to not spend more money, they're going to continue to spend more money.
And if you really want to see these guys at work, you can go to their office, they'll see nobody just like me. I go up there and visit with them, they welcome me in their office, we visit, we talk, have a say with them. So they're at work and they're approachable. So if you really want to have your voice heard, go down there and talk to them.
David, the governor's bragging how she made the rainy day fund go from $5 to, what is it, $250 million now or something. Can you actually explain that process of how they decide how that money goes into there and when to put it in there?
Right. Well, actually, it's a constitutional provision that was passed by the voters that says any amount of revenue in excess of 100% of the estimated revenues that comes in goes into the rainy day fund. This governor is not the only governor to take credit for things that are somewhat automatic. So I wouldn't lay the blame at her feet. I think the focus for us is not the rainy day fund. It's how much that government has taken in new revenue, over $1 billion, and yet they haven't passed any tax cuts for U.S. citizens. I think that's the litmus test, that they've increased certified spending by $800 million and not enacted one tax cut. And are now actually talking about tax increases this session.
Well, we have a $177 million shortfall. It's raining pretty hard.
Right, yes. It's shortfall in government terms.
David, thank you for coming and addressing us. I'm Scott Esk. I'm running for Mike Reynolds' term limited seat here in 2014 this year. I'm going to ask you something because nullification is a major part of my campaign. I want your thoughts on, A, have you read the book Nullification by Thomas Woods? And B, are you familiar with Charles Key had some legislation when he was last in office that would not allow the federal government to automatically get tax money from us, and we could declare things to be unconstitutional and therefore not worthy of getting money from us. What do you think about those?
I think any effort that lawmakers want to try, innovative efforts that haven't been tried or that have been tried 100 years ago, you can try those. But here's one of the things that I would say. Our side makes this way too hard. You want to stop federal money into the state? Then lawmakers just tell agencies don't apply for those grants anymore. You don't have to pass a law. You just have to say we're not going to do the Medicaid expansion. And you prevent the state from trying to grab over $10 billion from the feds over a 10-year period. There's other provisions like that. I would suggest one of the things that I think that our side is going to, it's the hardest, but government controls your life the most by the money they take from you. They can't, weird policy that they want to implement, they can't implement it unless they take your money from you and then hire highway patrol troopers to enforce it. And that's one of the reasons why we're trying to get, I myself and others, to get focused on spending is the biggest danger to you, because when they take your money from you, then they can hire 10 bureaucrats to run in 10 different directions and shake down the federal government for more money and implement this really weird policy in common education schools. And so that's why our big focus has been giving parents choice so that they can remove their kids from a failed system, and then cutting taxes and preventing them from getting the money in the first place to begin with. That's going to be the ultimate way to get it done. That's what's interesting. There are lawmakers who voted for some of these policy bills that push back against the federal government, but then voted for a budget that was dependent on shaking down more federal government revenues from the government. Where if they just stopped the budget process and forced the legislature to actually cut budgets last year, they would have done more to help the federal deficit than they would have to try to pass a bill that may or may not get signed or heard in the Senate. And that's why our focus is on, you get to keep more of your money. That's what we're focused on. We want you to keep more of your own money. Then that's where we can stop government in their creep if they don't get our money.
We have a question.
My name is Phyllis. I wondered if you would talk about, hasn't Mary Fallon proposed a tax reduction?
Yes, she has. She in her state address, and what I would argue has been it was a turn from some of the conversation in the summer. One of the more on point addresses. So we'll see what happens with the legislative session. She's recommending a 0.25% cut and cutting agencies 5%. And I think one of the interesting comments that she said is that agency directors and bureaucrats are going to claim that the sky is falling, but that it's not, and that the cuts in appropriations amount to what is 1% in total spending. And that's just appropriated revenues, so they're not cutting dedicated revenues that agencies get or that some programs get. But we think that there's a great opportunity to do more. As you've seen from these charts, we've got record growth. We've had over $1 billion worth of growth. There's a multitude of things that the legislature could do right now to cut taxes. Right now, they overpay for employee health benefits to the tune of $75 million a year. Right now, the state employee health insurance program is overpaying in its contract for surgeries out of fear of reprisal from the hospital system. So they're holding you, the taxpayer, hostage and overpaying for services when they could contract for a lower price and use places and the online pricing like at places like the surgery center. There's a host of different things like that that they're continuing to do. They could reform the Medicaid system and move to a system that better coordinates care, as Dr. Coburn and I and others have mentioned, and better manages care. That would save over $100 million a year. Florida, Kansas, and Louisiana cumulatively are saving billions of dollars by moving to those programs, getting away from just rewarding crony capitalists from a fee-for-service system that lets them take money from you just by performing a service. So those are all things that they could implement, and that we hope we see they implement, so that a tax cut can be even larger.
Question.
Yes.
Jonathan, thank you for coming. You're always very informational for all of us. My question has to do with all of the buildings and all of the empty state buildings and whatnot all over the state. We don't, as far as I know, we don't have anything in legislation that says, okay, we're going to sell these buildings, we're going to get them out of our inventory, we're going to take that money and we're going to put that money towards maintenance such as the Capitol and other facilities. There's all the time I hear problems with no money for maintenance and that sort of thing. Everybody here probably has a house and they know that they have maintenance costs every year that they're going to have to do on those facilities and those buildings. Why is it that our government is such idiots and don't put that in the budget for doing maintenance, and then they let these things fall apart, and then we have to end up taking care of demolishing them?
Well, the first problem is it's other people's money. That's the first problem. They're spending other people's money. And then the second thing is, so with that process, there is actually now a bill in place that's trying to dedicate the sale of assets. But one of the first problems is, and this shows you how dysfunctional government was, it took them 2 years to figure out how many buildings the state had. And now that they've finally come up with a list of how many buildings the state has, they're trying to figure out which ones they can sell at which point. And I think there is a bill that was passed that's intended to try to do that. But again, it's just a problem when you have someone else's money, you spend someone else's money, particularly if you're distant and you took it from them at the threat of gunpoint or imprisonment, which is how government takes money from us, takes donations from us. That when you're spending someone else's money, you're going to continue to have those kind of problems.
A quick question. You said that the governor was going to say cut 5% on all the agencies. Does that make it possible though for those agencies then to try to apply for grants to make up that money from the federal government, or is that something that?
I think it would have to be a case by case basis. I think right now, there's less of a chance to that in some of the bigger spending areas. You know, it's possible that maybe the federal government might have some individual programs. But one of the things that both lawmakers and the governor have pledged to do from this point forward is to monitor closely the application of agencies for federal revenues. Now, we'll see if they do it. It hasn't been done yet, but they're saying that that's one of the things that they want to be watching for is, you know, if they lose money from this hand, going to the feds and trying to get it in the other.
Okay, question. Jonathan, it seems like I read in the Constitution one day that it said that not one penny will be spent from the state treasury unless it's appropriated. Which seems that we completely ignore, in fact, OCPA ignores it. All the money that's being spent on federal grants should have to be appropriated by my reading of the Constitution. You disagree with that? And why don't you guys start promoting that so that legislators will realize the agencies can't spend that money unless the legislature appropriates it?
Well, you'll be happy because in our last budget book, that was probably only read by you and Representative Wesselhoff and people in our office, we pointed out that the legislature had just as equal a responsibility to provide oversight and authorize spending for federal grants as they did state appropriated dollars or dedicated revenue. But, you know, as you know, it's difficult to get, other than you and a few of your other colleagues, to get them to pay attention to that. But no, I would totally agree with you that it's a violation of state law when agencies go out and the Obamacare grant, how the agency was able to go and apply and almost get to the point of drawing down $54 million from the federal government. Should have, the Attorney General at that point or someone should have, sought to stop the agency in court at that time. And not our current Attorney General, because he wasn't in office at that time, but in 2009, the former Attorney General.
Just another question?
Another question. We had devastating tornadoes go through Moore, Oklahoma, which wiped billions of dollars of property off the tax rolls and should have wiped billions of dollars of property taxes off the tax rolls. And Moore would just, and Cleveland County would just really be suffering for educational funding. Has that transpired? And if not, can you explain why?
I think that that's what you would hear. I have not been able to look at Moore's school district revenue. Moore is that's not in Oklahoma County. Is that in Cleveland? And there are parts of it are in Cleveland. That's a good question. And you bring up what we've talked about. Superintendents and school districts can't come to you as state taxpayers and complain about how much revenue they don't have, when schools right now are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on activities other than reading, writing, and arithmetic. I was homeschooled. There was never any confusion in our house that me playing for the homeschool Knights was somehow a core component of education that my grandparents and aunt and uncle should help my parents fund. I mean, that was never there. It's amazing. I had people, I kid you not, I had teachers and superintendents respond to the pictures and say, how dare you? That was money that we spent on the local level. We didn't take a state dollar and buy that, monstrosity Greyhound party looking bus. Jonathan, you don't understand how education works. And I said, well, actually, no, I do. I actually worked in the Oklahoma City Public Schools for 7 years. No, you still don't understand. You can't have social interaction or learn teamwork without sports. And I said, no, I'm pretty sure you can learn teamwork in an Algebra 2 class, and you can learn social interaction in a history or a political science class. And so we've got to change this whole notion. That's our biggest problem in public education, is they are doing too much stuff that they shouldn't be doing. And it's going to take parents saying, my kid's reading and writing is more important than whether or not they can learn
Okay. Well, just one more. That would make me want to say something else, but.
You're limited to 3 questions.
Yeah, so I won't say anything about the fact that parents take their kids to sports on Sunday mornings and all these other times, and no wonder they don't care what happens in the schools. But so really a tornado is like the best thing that can ever happen to education, because wouldn't you agree, if my house is wiped out, I still have to pay the property taxes. We passed some bill that ameliorated a portion of that, but basically property taxes are still being collected, and then when the new house goes back on the rolls, the property taxes are going to jump way up, to say nothing of the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of sales tax that are being collected to build all the facilities in the new area. And so there's a massive amount of more money poured into those areas that you weren't going to have anyway.
Right. Well, and what we've seen, this is one of the interesting, what you're talking about, this chart shows that. $300 million more in a year in local revenues. And which is a testament to you all as taxpayers because you're working hard. But there are some school districts who have some funding problems, but those problems have to do with the law of numbers. And if people don't want to live in an area, or there's not enough people living in an area, you're going to have trouble funding things that are in that area. And that's a different problem than we just need more money for education.
All right, we thank you very much, John, for coming and bringing this information for us. I always have plenty of information. We're going to take about 20 minutes here, and we're going to rant just a minute. And I'm going to begin the rant to give you some information, or at least some ammunition to start with. I'd like to talk about this dark day that happened last week when the President of our United States stood up to give us the State of the Union, and we never got there. I was amazed, first of all, that he stands in the halls of the House of Representatives and he says to them, if I can't work with these people, I'll just use my pen and I'll write law. And they stood and applauded him. Do they know what they did? Do they know that they stood and applauded tyranny over using the system that the United States was built on of representatives of the people making law? Say what? I didn't hear you.
Throw the bums out.
Okay. And the other thing that really made me mad is this My RA thing he was talking about. I remember history before I was born in '54, that they started a program called the Social Security Program that was supposed to be our retirement program. They spent all that money away, and now they want to start another program where we go into a My RA that we can protect ourselves in the future again. So those are two things that I thought about. Do you have some comments? You might want to talk about that.
Hi, I'm Woody. This is not anything to do with section 5-34.
We're not going to read it 3 times.
No. What I wanted to comment on is be careful what you wish for. Everybody's been wanting a smaller government. And I submit that we have one now. We have a Congress that's not there anymore. All we have is the one man in control. We have our dictatorship. We have our smaller government.
I would say that's probably true. Thank you, Woody.
My name's Rick, and I heard something on the radio the other day that really I never really thought of it that way. I know we had a lot of people complain about how much golf the president plays, and someone said that, man, if he's playing golf, he's not legislating, he's not signing anything. So I would really encourage him to play more golf, and maybe take some of his cronies with him, because I'm really tired of them trampling on the Constitution. They take this and they use it as a doormat. They don't realize what they're doing. It's all about power. Both parties have pretty much become equally worthless, and it's all about money, and it's all about retaining power. It has nothing to do with upholding the Constitution or serving the people who put them there. And that's my humble.
Somebody else have a statement.
I'll just make a comment about the State of the Union message and demonstrate my geekiness by referring to a movie where one of the characters said in front of the legislature that was applauding to losing their jobs, "So that's how liberty dies, to thunderous applause."
How many of you bothered to listen to the State of the Union address? How many of you were able to make it all the way through without regurgitating? Okay. Do you have a comment?
Yeah.
Another comment from Dr. Steve. This is my pastor, by the way. That's why he gets extra comments.
He's my associate pastor. My comment is I've been encouraged because there's beginning to be talk now about impeachment. It may not ever happen, but I would like to see it at least brought to the fore, because I think that the conservatives need to take a stand and say, look, this guy has violated his oath of office. He's trampled on the Constitution, and it needs to be at least stated that he is really worthy of impeachment.
I don't disagree with you. I think that most of those guys up there are afraid that they would ruin their political career and they would lose their retirement program if they were to speak out against the president on impeachment.
The only thing I have against impeachment is look who follows him.
Oh, that's scary.
It is.
Somebody else, before we go today, we're going to close this meeting up. Harold, did you have something else?
Yeah.
Come on up here. You got something on your heart, let's hear it.
No, I've never been able to understand why the streets and the roads in Oklahoma are the sorriest things in the whole United States. Now right down south of here, there's a bridge that can't be used for another 6 months or so. Why hasn't this been looked after along, kind of patched up a little bit to do something? I mean, and why can't we get streets in this whole country around here? Reno Street down here, you got to hang on, Carl, throw you out. And I live over in Dale City, and they don't know what retiring streets are. They just don't get into that at all. And That's no sense.
And I think we'll end on that one. Who's coming next week? Chris and Paul. Okay, and she has a presentation on the history of our country and the preservation of the country that we live in now. And you guys come back and see us next week. We appreciate you being here for High Noon Club.